Disaster capitalism is a term that's kind of hard to define at first glance due to the nature of capitalism in 2020. Is disaster capitalism the way that resources necessary to survive, like water, can be bought out from under poorer countries by way of privatization of municipally owned goods, like Coca-Cola did with India? Nope, that's just normal capitalism. What about when a company unleashes harmful pollutants and somehow doesn't consider that in the math of the overall cost of doing business, instead passing it off as an externality to the nearby communities? Well, still your standard capitalism. So what makes disaster capitalism so special when capitalism is already such a disaster? Defined by Naomi Klein in her book The Shock Doctrine, disaster capitalism refers to strategy in American policy, domestic and abroad, where crises or disasters are used to get otherwise unpopular ideas pushed through while people are in a shock and thereby less likely to resist. Disaster capitalism is like being re-gifted the same gift year after year, and regardless of how many times you return it, you get it the next year, only somehow every year it's subsequently shittier and shittier. Klein brings up a Milton Friedman quote that defines his philosophy perfectly. The quote, "Only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. When that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around. That, I believe, is our basic function. To develop alternatives to existing policies, to keep them alive and available until the politically impossible becomes the politically inevitable." Disaster capitalism typically operates with the intent of handing things off to an outside entity that lacks stake in the community, but is also desperate to make some money by any means necessary while reducing accountability to any problems that might arise under that new management. It's particularly terrible since crises often result in people reassessing their priorities in order to improve the system they're operating within, but this uses that impetus as a cover for what is often a highly orchestrated robbery. However, the ensuing crisis has mostly been seen by the Trump administration as a prime opportunity to polish some particularly stinky political turds. Instead of working to provide relief to Americans like a real human leader with real human empathy, Trump has sought to provide relief to businesses poisoning them or exposing them to COVID-19 while simultaneously removing the rights of people to speak up about it. While quarantine has seen decreases in smog due to a drop in commuting, Trump has seen this as slack for industry to pick up. And since COVID-19 is airborne, who knows? Maybe particulates weigh it down? I don't know. Science isn't really involved in a lot of these policy decisions. In addition to this, the Trump administration has sought to work with big energy companies to block the First Amendment rights of its constituents by making it a felony to protest critical infrastructure, which just so happens to include oil pipelines and other controversial oil and gas projects. In the face of an unprecedented pandemic, it's become clear that the goal shouldn't be to prevent unnecessary suffering or prevent the spread of a deadly virus. It should be to block people from saying mean things about the underhanded shit you do. When the story about Trump's financial situation broke recently, the media covered how little he paid in taxes, and while that's shocking, the part that received surprisingly little coverage in the mainstream media is the fact that Trump owes $421 million to foreign entities, stating that he doesn't know if he owes that amount to a foreign bank. Which in Trump speak means yes, but I can't say yes, but if I'm being honest, I wish I would have just not said anything to begin with, but I'm here now, like when he biffed this layup. In order to prevent himself from becoming a private citizen and risk having to face collection of this massive debt, Trump's strategy has been to attack the post office directly, as there's been a massive shift to mail-in voting in response to the coronavirus pandemic. I had my first time voting by mail-in ballot in the primary, and I have to say I actually really appreciated being able to go over each individual candidate and review their positions. And by doing so, I even found out that one of the candidates that I thought was representing my views wasn't the person best representing them, and I ended up changing that. That being said, I'm voting in person now, while coronavirus numbers are much worse than they were previously, because I don't trust that my ballot will be counted if I do mail-in voting this time. This whole situation demonstrates how a disaster capitalist can view a massive public disaster as a solution to a private disaster. As a narcissist, there's little doubt that Trump's creditor situation makes the massive problems and the number of deaths totaling over 200,000 now seem like peanuts by comparison. Trump has mounted his attack by putting Louis DeJoy, a campaign donor with transport and contract logistic connections, in the position of Postmaster General, despite a lack of experience related to the post office, which is a move that is completely unprecedented. What DeJoy did bring to the table, however, was a $600,000 contribution shortly before being named to this position. DeJoy also pressured employees into making donations by way of bonuses provided by his company, which would possibly constitute an illegal straw donor scheme. He's currently avoiding FEC scrutiny, though, because they only have 3 of 4 members appointed, so they can't even form a quorum to meet. So just to reiterate, Trump is kneecapping a massively popular service that reaches all Americans for dirt cheap while operating without taxpayer funding. While there are currently some budgeting issues, they're mostly manufactured by Republicans in order to create this situation that requires the exact thing that they wanted to implement anyways. This situation was staged 15 years ago, when George W. Bush signed the Postal Accountability and Enhancement Act of 2006. This was sponsored by the Koch brothers and has been a part of their attack on public services that has been taking place since the 1970s. Support of this plan seems to be broadly held by Trump's base, despite the fact that they would find themselves paying more to do day-to-day mailings, which for many includes medication. Never mind that this would also be terrible for small businesses that have any shipping component and likely lead to businesses having a closure situation that's similar to what's going on with a lot of restaurants, where they end up closing in droves. While small businesses are generally trotted out as the epitome of American ingenuity, this has proven to be mostly just talk with the way that they've handled COVID-19 relief with the PPP loans. Overall, a total of $521 billion was given out, with the average loan being $107,000. This supposedly supported 51 million jobs, with 84% being small businesses. Changing terms made it difficult for recipients to use the money accurately, though, as businesses initially had to spend 75% on payroll within the first 8 weeks for it to be forgivable. After receiving some public pressure, this was eventually changed to 60% over the course of 24 weeks, but for businesses that acted in good faith, the news came too late and the damage was already done. Businesses found some difficulty in anticipating how exactly coronavirus would affect operations, and have therefore been finding that their loans don't accurately reflect their situation. And that's if they're lucky enough to not be a part of minority populations who have been finding difficulty getting those loans in the first place. Additionally, banks are standing to make $18 billion in fees just from processing PPP loans, seeing bigger fees for bigger loans. This means there's an incentive for them to prioritize larger businesses over smaller ones. That loan forgiveness that was mentioned earlier is also a fairly complicated system, so firms that can afford lawyers to navigate that are also more likely to receive that benefit. This carries over the pay-to-play aspect from our legal system over into economic relief. Which is odd because one would think that the name of the game here was playing in order to get paid instead of paying to play. If we want to see a potential post-COVID future, all we have to do is look at New Orleans following Hurricane Katrina. After the storm, disaster capitalism was implemented as a response, with an emphasis placed on privatization at multiple levels. This despite policy already in place having a demonstrable track record. Dating back to the Depression era as a response to anxieties about being displaced by low-priced labor, the Davis-Bacon Act sought to establish a baseline wage that workers on projects must be paid. The idea behind this was that by creating a baseline for funding, the skill of local workers would be raised with a hands-on project, while also providing those local workers with a source of income that was used to stimulate the local economy. This was suspended following Katrina due to concerns over wasteful inefficiencies and delays. Even though when the Northridge earthquake caused the collapse of the Santa Monica Freeway in 1994, rebuilding was able to occur in less than half the allotted time by the state. While some procurement rules were relaxed in the construction, rules affecting workers and their compensation weren't. And as a result, the project had some leeway, allowing people working on the project to deliver efficiently without removing that stimulus aspect. The prospect of cutting costs up to 20% was used to rationalize suspension of the Davis-Bacon Act. But research has demonstrated that these theories don't actually have any bearing in reality. Instead, this kept money out of the hands of the local economy when it could have desperately used the cash infusion. In the weeks following the storm, the city of New Orleans fired 7,500 public school teachers from one of the largest and strongest unions in the state of Louisiana, in a push to privatize the education system while everything was in a state of disarray. Prior to the storm, then Governor Kathleen Blanco had taken over a few of the poorer performing schools and removed the charter school model. But in the few months following this storm, the state had taken over virtually all of New Orleans schools. The results of this have been a disaster financially while also alienating students. Following this, Louisiana has seen many closures of these schools. Sent money towards schools that stayed open for only a single school year, or some that didn't even make it as far as opening their doors. In their report, Asleep at the wheel, how the federal charter schools program recklessly takes taxpayers and students for a ride revealed that nationally up to $1 billion was wasted this way at a time when America is having a hard time scraping together the resources to provide its students a decent education. We can see a reboot of this idea currently being led by Education Secretary Betsy DeVos, who siphoned $180 million in public education funds from the CARES Act off for charter schools. This has been done in the form of microgrants to provide students with money to pay for tuition at private or charter schools, many of which are religious and practicing kind of fringe religious beliefs. One such school that received financial support was the Wright Graduate School of the Realization of Human Potential, a private college which prior to the New York Times article exposing it, had a website dedicated to explaining how it's not a cult, guys, and now has it redirect to the college website. However, I've included a link to the cached website if you'd like to check it out. As always, that, along with all the other links, is included in the description. DeVos has long been an outspoken advocate for this accountability-free model since her role as the head of the All Children Matter PAC, which was used to illegally launder money into political campaign funds and fined $5.2 million for that activity. It wasn't fined while she was in that role, but based on her track record with her organization and Trump's track record with his organizations and appointing people who are willing to launder money into his campaigns, it's hard not to think she was doing some shady shit during her tenure. Additionally, she championed the Detroit charter school system, which was described by Tulane University economics professor Douglas Harris as what even charter advocates acknowledge is the biggest school reform disaster in the country. When compared against other schools in the National Assessment of Education Progress, Detroit was outpaced by far by any other participating city, with this being attributed to a lack of oversight, which is a common complaint with charter school implementation. Even when it's not relegated to the charter school debate, education has long been a favorite tool to manage or deliberately mismanage because it provides levers to a variety of different groups. For example, foreign students were scapegoated and had their legal immigration status threatened thanks to the coronavirus crisis. While he had previously sought to limit immigration broadly in the past, Trump repackaged the same idea in the face of the coronavirus crisis, while also using it as leverage to force universities and schools to open back up despite the clear danger that presents. This brings up an important part about how disaster capitalists work. They use disasters to siphon relief away from people who actually need it, and hoard it away for themselves despite having more wealth than they could ever hope to spend, while those who actually need it to survive are left wanting, with the consequences of these problems often having cascading effects. At the same time, some people are using this crisis to make good and necessary changes, using this break from normalcy to allow them to participate in political movements to bring about changes that benefit citizens, like the ones I mentioned in my previous video. In that regard, I've got to give it up to my home state of Pennsylvania. Leadership is using the crisis to bring in much needed finances, using a strategy that would have otherwise taken much longer to change due to an entrenched status quo. In the past few months, Governor Tom Wolf and Lieutenant Governor John Fetterman have been using data found from a statewide speaking tour that found overwhelming support for marijuana legalization, and have been using this to begin pushing it through at a state level and looking boss while doing it. Pennsylvania has been stubborn to keep up with other states that have been making money hand over fist while cutting enforcement due to the fact that they've been legalizing, regulating, and taxing marijuana. Tackling marijuana legalization is an incredibly smart position to take during a pandemic for a number of reasons. For one, it's wildly popular. When polled, 65 to 70% of participating Pennsylvanians supported legalization. 2, in states where it's been enacted, it's brought in tons of tax dollars to support a variety of causes, ranging from criminal rehabilitation programs, drug rehabilitation programs, education, economic development, or really any kind of public good that a community could need. 3, it saves money on enforcement. Even if you don't personally partake in marijuana, it's hard not to deny that its enforcement is more damaging than the drug itself. The amount saved on enforcement, plus the amount coming in from taxation, makes this financially a no-brainer. Reason 4, 20, staying home, smoking weed, glued to your couch, watching TV, or playing video games can save lives right now, at a time when going out to a bar could easily become a super spreader event. Legalizing weed both creates jobs and encourages people to stay home at a time where we need both of those things to happen. For people who haven't tried marijuana, a boring night at home also provides the curious cannabis consumer with the ideal opportunity to try it in a low-pressure environment that they're familiar with. Therefore, they're a little less likely to experience the paranoia that has sometimes come to ruin marijuana for some consumers. This is a good start. Now is also the ideal time to put forth other necessary changes that would make our system that much more equitable and able to run that much smoother. Presenting alternatives to disaster capitalism that have broader support and are revenue positive instead of destructive makes these policies look that much worse by comparison. After all, your options are to bring in tax revenue while reducing overall daily expenses, or making do with less in the future so the wealthy upper class can make even more off of your misery. It's up to you. By entering this disaster capitalist dialogue with goals and a vision in mind, it's a lot harder to ignore injustice and continue with that status quo, or make that status quo that much worse. If you like this content, give me a thumbs up. Also, subscribe so you can see my next video. You can also find my content on how we're in the cool zone and the opportunity it presents, or some of my other content here. Thanks for watching. I hope to see you again.